Hello, welcome to this video about the railroad and how the railroad changed the American West from the 1860s. So some key knowledge points for this topic. The railroads had a really destructive impact on the lifestyles of indigenous peoples. President Lincoln approved plans for a transcontinental railroad to link the east and west coasts of the USA in 1862. Two companies were encouraged to build the railroad as quickly as possible with a land incentive. 6,400 acres of land was given for every mile of track that they built. The railroad was completed in 1869, and the railroad marked a permanent path through indigenous people's lands and severely disrupted their buffalo hunting, and railroads encouraged further permanent white settlement on the plains during this time period. Okay, so here's a map which shows you what the West looked like in 1861. So in 1861, the Great Plains had not yet been colonised. As we've seen, people travelled across the Great Plains in the 1840s and 1850s, making their way west to Oregon and California. The white Americans had gone to settle in Oregon and California, and they had become states by this time. But the railroad was about to link east and west and bring about the whole colonisation of America. Now, this is a really famous image from Francis Palmer, which was made in 1868. It's the most used image in American textbooks, and it presents an idealized image of the idea of the manifest destiny, which was the idea that white Americans had a God-given right to settle and colonize the West. Okay, so this painting, which is called Across the Continent, was from Frances Palmer, and she was originally born in Leicester in England, and she migrated to the USA in 1844, and she was one of the first women to make her name as an artist in the USA. And she was based in New York, and this painting very much presents an eastern viewpoint of the West. Now, in the distance is wilderness, symbolising the places that the USA had not yet settled or colonised. It's obviously misleading, as indigenous peoples were already living on the plains during this time, people like the Lakota, for example. In the left is an existing US settlement showing farmers working the land. Resources are shown as being plentiful, and in the foreground is a public school, which represents kind of like civilization and education. The train journey itself is linking New York to San Francisco, so from East Coast to West Coast. It was made in 1868, and so the context of this painting is that it's a year before the Golden Spike was hammered into the ground in 1869, May 1869, which completed the line. The image is, of course, an imagined, idealised portrayal of the West made from the point of view of people in the East, like Francis Palmer. Now, the right-hand side of the picture is sparsely populated. Two indigenous peoples can be shown on horseback, and a herd of buffalo can be seen also in the distance. And there is a hint that traditional ways of life of indigenous peoples are sadly about to be destroyed. So the American government had explored the idea of building a railroad from east to west since the 1850s. It was in July 1862 that President Lincoln approved the Pacific Railroad Act, which offered the US government money to railroad companies to link the east and the west of the USA. Now, the act also offered the railroad companies land on either side of the track. It was 6,400 acres for every mile built. They could sell the land to settlers. So the more track that they built, the more land that they got, and indigenous peoples lost any rights over land. By 1864, the US government had $50 million of funding, and there were two companies who were building. The Union Pacific were building west from Council Bluffs in Iowa, and the Central Pacific Company were building east from Sacramento in California. Now, there's plenty of funding for the railroads on level ground. The railroad companies got $16,000 for every mile of track. On the plateaus, they got $32,000, and in the mountains, $48,000 for every mile of track. Now, the lobbyists got the rates doubled within just 1 year, and very famously, a geologist called Josiah Whitney, who's pictured there, the company, Central Pacific Company, got him to declare the gently sloping Sacramento Valley region a mountainous region to get more funding for the company. The highest peak was named Mount Whitney to honour the geologist Josiah Whitney. Now, Congress also gave 6,400 acres of federal land for every mile built, and this is where the cash really kind of came in for the railroad companies. This was the equivalent of the whole of California and most of Montana in terms of size. Railroad companies were then able to sell off this land to homesteaders and people moving west onto the plains, and this in turn encouraged more people to move onto the plains and encouraged more business for the railroad companies as well. Now, the Central Pacific line got stuck in the Sierra Nevada mountains. They found it very, very difficult to recruit workers. Workers often left to try and find their fortune in the Nevada gold fields. Chinese laborers were brought in to work on the railroad. 12,000 Chinese workers ended up working on the railroad in the Sierra Nevada mountains. That was about 80% of the workforce. The work on the railroads was really difficult. The weather conditions were often absolutely freezing in the winter, boiling hot in the summers. The use of explosives and working in the Sierra Nevada mountains was extremely dangerous. 1,200 Chinese workers tragically died whilst working on the railroad. So you can see here a map of the railroad. So you can see the red line is the Union Pacific line, which went from Omaha in Nebraska all the way to meet the Central Pacific line at Promontory Summit, which is in Utah, not far from the Great Salt Lake. And the Central Pacific line went from Sacramento, that went east and obviously met up with the Union Pacific line. You can see there where the other existing train lines were in the east. And more train lines would come after this, linking sort of north and south, as well as east-west. Now, on the 10th of May 1869, a huge crowd gathered at Promontory Point in the Utah desert as the final spike was hammered in to join the two railroads. A telegraph operator sent a message that America was now connected from coast to coast to San Francisco and New York, and America now had a transcontinental railroad linking the two major cities, New York and San Francisco, and joining the country together, making the USA a truly sort of continental power. Now, there's Leland Stanford, the former governor of California. He had the job of hammering the last spike to ceremoniously link the two lines together. He very famously missed when he was hammering the spike in, but it didn't matter. The railroad was completed, and this was a huge kind of achievement, and made travel across the plains area and travel between east and west very, very quick now to do. And if you think back to what we learned about when we did some of the journeys that went west in the 1840s and 1850s onto the place like the Oregon Trail, for example, can see how significant this was in terms of the progress of the USA, but also their colonization of the whole of America. So the railroads had both positive and negative impacts on the different groups within the USA. In terms of impact on railroad companies and investors, made these companies and people associated with them extremely wealthy. People like Leland Stanford, we've already talked about. Lots and lots of funding for those railroad companies. They got huge amounts of land which they were able to sell off. The railway companies advertised for people to come and buy the land on the plains, both from people in the eastern USA, but also immigrants from Europe as well. In terms of the indigenous peoples on the plains, the railroads cut through indigenous peoples' lands. They disrupted the buffalo hunting grounds. They also encouraged more settlers and cattle ranchers to settle on indigenous peoples' lands on the plains, and white Americans would come to dominate the plains. So this is an absolutely pivotal event in terms of, as we will find, leading to much more conflict between the American government and the indigenous peoples, and there's various wars that take place on the plains during the 1860s and 1870s. In terms of the impact on workers, thousands of workers need to build the lines. As we found out, 12,000 workers were Chinese immigrants, people who came to the USA from China. They received very poor pay, worked in terribly dangerous conditions. Accident rates were very, very high. We've already found out that 1,200 Chinese workers died. That's around about 10%. And then in terms of the USA, new towns were created on the railroad lines. We're going to refer to those as the cow towns. Many of these could be violent, drunken and unruly. Towns soon grew and law and order did improve with the introduction of people like sheriffs, for example. The first railroad inspired the building of other lines across the West, and by the 1880s, the journey across the USA could be made in days instead of months. So various impacts of the railroad on the USA, but pivotally it led to a sort of an economic boom that was enjoyed by mainly white Americans and investors, companies in the East, for example, and crucially it led to the colonization basically of the plains, and led to increased tensions and eventually the conflict between white Americans and indigenous peoples. So there you have it. That's some key information about how the railroads changed the USA in the 1860s and 1870s and beyond. Thank you very much for listening.